We are rolling.
Okay. My name is Robert Franklin. I'm conducting an oral history interview with James Anderson on March 14th, 2017. The interview is being conducted on the campus of Washington State University Tri-Cities. I'll be talking with Jim about his experiences working at the Hanford site. And for the record, can you state and spell your full name for us?
James Daniel Anderson, Jamesdaniel Anderson.
Great, thank you, Jim. And so, tell me how and why you came to the Hanford site.
Okay, I was born in Denver,
Okay.
and when I was in my fourth year, my dad worked for DuPont, which was Remington Arms back there, and they transferred him out here to this new secret project.
And what year would this have been?
That would have been 44, early 44.
Okay, so you were born in 1940.
I was born 39
39,
actually.
okay.
I turned 5 after we got here.
Sure.
So, and my dad was a machinist,
Okay.
and he came to Hanford making the first fuels that went to B reactor. And I remember this story. He's told it many a time, but he hated machining uranium because it was hard in spots and it was soft in spots. And so you could gouge deeply or you might not cut enough. And so the filings would go on the floor. And back then they didn't have protective clothing then. It was just do the work. And he and another guy that worked there got some uranium fines stuck in their soles of their shoes. And so they went to the movies one night. And on the way to the movies, they were looking at their feet and they were sparking. And that was from the uranium fines that was embedded in their shoes. Uranium is somewhat pyrophoric, and so they learned early on about that.
So pyrophoric. What is that exactly?
It's burnable, basically,
Okay.
and it can sometimes catch fire on its own.
Oh,
But
wow. I guess that's what makes it such a good fuel.
well, when I was in grade school, I knew I wanted to be a chemist, and so we used to make pyrophoric materials, firecrackers, bombs, rockets, and things like that. And so I'm somewhat familiar with that. And down at the Richland Library, you could get books on it. They had them there, and they'd give you the formulas and everything. And being a kid, I used to go to the pharmacist and get my chemicals. And when we'd go on vacation, like to Denver or to Seattle or something, they had the chemical companies there. I'd go down and I'd get whatever I needed. Nobody asked me, questioned me, or anything. I just did it. And so we used to make gunpowder and stuff like that. I even made from an erector set, a rocket that would go around in a circle, and we had chemical fuses, so that we knew about how long it would take for it to ignite, self-ignite. And it didn't go. And so I went there and I put some more potassium permanganate on it, and it took off. And the exhaust hit my shirt, and needless to say, I was on fire for a short period of time.
Wow.
And that wasn't so bad, but going home, Mom did not like that. So I had a good lecture and so forth. But go ahead.
Oh, no, you go ahead.
But I always enjoyed that. And when I was a kid, Richland looked like a battlefield. There was no grass, only trees where there had been orchards. And when the wind blew, they used to say, on a clear day you can see the house across the street. And that was pretty much true, and that stuff was so fine, it would go in the windowsills and just settle. And they also called them termination winds, because a lot of ladies came to meet their husbands, you know, that had been working here. And after one of those storms, they'd say, honey, I'm leaving. If you want to stay married, you're coming with me. And so that happened. But we lived at the hotel down here in Richland until our house was ready, and then we moved in. And we were a few days later than our neighbors. We were in a bee house. So in 1957 or thereabouts, when they sold the town, they had first priority, and of course they bought the house. So we had to move and find another house. So that was very interesting. And my boyfriend and I would crawl under the porches and stuff, and we would find spiders galore, especially the ones with the red hourglass. And so we used to play with those, you know. And of course our parents always told us no. But one of those black widows, when we were playing across the street from where I lived, it was still wild out there. There wasn't grass or anything. And one of them crawled up my leg. And I felt it, and I thought, uh-oh, I'm in trouble. So I thought, well, if I jump up and down as hard as I can, it'll fall out, and it did. And I never played with them after that. But it was funny, my mother would get a stick that looked like, as a kid, about 10 foot long, and she'd get the spider on the end of it, and she'd walk across the street where she was going to kill it. And as she was walking, the spider would crawl on the stick towards her. Closer it got, the faster she went. And then when she got there, the spider was no more. But it was fun for kids in those days. And in fact, the streets were none. They were just dirt. GW was dirt. So it was kind of interesting, you know. And in the summer, when it was real hot and real dry, that stuff was very powdery. And I can remember walking to the grocery store and coming back, and the inside of my pant legs were covered with that dust.
Wow.
So it was fun. I enjoyed that. We used to go down by Fred Meyer, and that was a swamp back then. And I don't know if you guys knew that or not, but they got a pump house down there too, and they used to. But there were frogs galore, pollywogs, cattails, you name it. It was a good place for boys to play, and we did. And I can remember we'd take these home, and they'd change into frogs, obviously, and then we'd let them loose. And a lot of them would bury themselves in the flower gardens. And I can remember my dad in the spring hoeing around the bushes and so forth, and every so often, out would come a frog. So, but that was fun, just to go down there and play and stuff. And most people back then didn't even lock their doors. I mean, everybody had Q clearances. I don't know if they were called Q clearances when I was a kid, but and I remember this place was so hush-hush, I never knew what my dad did, even after they announced the bomb had been dropped. I can remember he never said anything about his job or what he did. And when I, years later, when I went to work at Hanford, I got to go visit him where he worked. And so I got to learn what he did. He was in the water plant.
Was he still working at Hanford when you started at Hanford?
Oh, yeah. He retired from N-Reactor.
Okay. And when your father started, you said early on he started as a fuels fabrication for B reactor, and what area was he working out of then?
That was 300 area.
Okay, and how long did he do that for?
Not very long. He hated it, and so he transferred out to B reactor. And he was out at B reactor when they had their startup problems, and then he was there when they solved the problem, and away they went. DuPont always over-designed, as far as I know, their work that they did. And of course, they were told so many tubes for the reactor, and they made about twice as many. And so when I think it was Enrico Fermi went into the room, and he, with the slide rule, we didn't have computers, and he determined what it was, and he came up with the term Barnes. And so he discovered what it was, and then they filled all the rest of the tubes up, and away they went. And that was an exciting time. Dad remembers when that happened. And
what did he do at B reactor?
he was in the water plant. They would pump the water out of the river, clean it up, and pass it through the reactor. And from there, it would go into cooling or whatever, and then it would eventually go back into the river. And I can remember, now this is aside from that, but the Columbia River flows over some uranium fields. I don't know if you knew that, and I think they're up in Canada. But because of all the reactors on the river, and they cleaned it up to run it through, there was more uranium in the water coming into the site than there was leaving the site. So, and the place he worked, I'll tell you, it was hot. It was steam as well as the water purification. And he always loved a hot house. And of course, none of the rest of us in the family really enjoyed that. But when it got down to 90 or 80, that was starting to get cold.
Wow.
But yeah, he was.
I guess he must have liked summers in Richland without air conditioning.
Well, in fact, when we came, we had no air conditioning, and eventually we got swamp coolers, and you could leave the front door open and cool the house down. Humidity back then was something like 5%, and of course, as they put in the crops and stuff up the valley, then the humidity went up and they weren't quite as efficient anymore. But I can remember when we put our first one in, and oh, that felt so good.
Yeah, it makes a big difference. Just water evaporation makes a big difference. And so you, what type of alphabet house did your family move into?
We moved into a B house.
Okay, and is it the 2-story or the 1-story?
It's a 1-story duplex.
Right.
And back then in the basement, they had a little room, if you will, for coal. Mm-hmm. And so the company would supply you with the coal whenever you wanted it. You'd call them up and say, I want some coal. And they'd bring it to you, and then you'd have to stoke the furnace and so forth. Later on, a lot of them put in an automatic feed into the furnace. And once in a while, those would catch fire. And sometimes that coal would make a gas in there, and it would blow up. And the door, of course, would swing open when it blew.
Sounds really dangerous.
It sounds it, but it wasn't that bad. But a lot of people got rid of coal when they sold the homes and stuff, and then they did whatever they wanted, electrical baseboards or so forth.
What was your overall impression of the alphabet houses?
Well, they are all basically look-alikes. I mean, you may have an A and a B and stuff close together, or a C or whatever, but when you get down to it, one section of the block could be the same as the other side of the block or whatever. This is stories I've heard. A lot of the men, especially the men, would come home from having a party down at the tavern or whatever, and since most people didn't lock the doors, they would just go inside, and because they knew each house was the same, and they'd go and they'd start to get ready for bed. And of course, when they discovered that the wife was not his, they immediately left. So.
And what about the quality of construction, or kind of, the how it was like to live in an Alphabet House? Do you have any impressions on that?
Actually, the construction for the Alphabet houses was pretty high, I think. They used good wood. Now, they didn't put a lot of insulation in a lot of houses, and so a lot of people had to come back and add insulation. I have a Q house now, and it just had a foil strip between the sheetrock and the wall, and that was the insulation. Supposedly it would reflect it, and so when I bought the house, I had to add insulation to it.
It says here that DuPont grouped workers together from different sites they were transferred from, so that your father or mother knew a lot of their neighbors when they moved to Richland.
Yes, in fact, I lived in the south end of town, and everybody around where I lived was from Denver.
Oh.
And so they did that because it made it kind of feel like home.
Sure. There's some semblance of familiarity, or.
Yes. And what was across from the Uptown District, there was a lot of people there that was from Salt Lake, because that was another DuPont site. And they used to call that Little Salt Lake. And my dad had a friend that he worked with back in Colorado, and he worked up here as well. He came up here, and those two were friends, best friends, for 77 years.
Wow.
And so my dad died first, and so my dad died at 92, and his buddy died a couple of years later.
Why do you think your family decided to stay after World War II?
Well, actually, the benefits, your homes to begin with were free, and if you wanted your house painted or whatever, you could do that. So there was a lot of benefits to stay, and you didn't have to pay rent, stuff like that. So it was nice. And once you made friends, and of course where we lived, it was from Colorado area, then a lot of people didn't want to stay. There were some that left. Now, I'll be honest. They wanted to go back where their relatives were or whatever, and I'd say at least half of them came back. They thought this was a better place.
Was your family from Colorado originally?
Yes.
Okay.
My dad was born in Colorado, and so was my mother.
And so growing up, you went to all of the Richland area schools, right? Lewis and Clark, Carmichael, and then Columbia High, right?
Yes. In fact, just a second, there was, we'd go to school, and we'd see somebody new. It was always, where are you from? There was something like a handful of kids that were from this area. And by the time I graduated from high school, we had over 1,000 there. And I'd guess just about half, not half, about a handful or so in number were actually born here.
Mm.
And I belong to the Rambling Rovers right now, which is an old-timers group. And the school that's still out at Hanford, I mean, it's just a shell. But they eventually, the town got so big and stuff, they used it for a grade school rather than the high school. So yeah, it was fun. The only problem is they opened Chief Joe up the same time as we had Carmichael, and we used to play each other in basketball. And they had the all-stars, if you will, in their school, and when we'd play them, you know, we'd lose by tons of points. And when we got to the high school on the starting basketball team, 4 were from Chief Joe, 1 from Carmichael. And they originally, when they built Carmichael, they originally were planning on putting a pool underneath the basketball court, and that never materialized. But
what do you remember about civil defense in school?
yes, we did have some civil defense activities. The main thing I really remember is all around town were these sirens. And they always tested at the same time each month. And I don't remember exactly, but it seemed to me like it was the last day of the month.
And these were evacuation sirens or air raid?
Either. They would wail or they could go straight. And those were loud. I mean, loud. And in back of Fred Meyer up in the hill there was the one that was closest to our house. And but then they took all of them down, and it was normal, I guess you'd say, again.
Do you remember doing duck and cover?
Yes.
And can you describe that? Like, well, what would happen in the classroom, and what was that to protect against?
Well, you'd crawl underneath the desk so that falling debris and stuff would not have as great a chance to hurt you. So the biggest thing I hated in grade school was kindergarten. They had mats, and you had to take a rest period during kindergarten. And, you know, I gave up naps like when I was 2 or so. And you go back to school and they wanted you to lay on the gym floor on those mats. And that was horrible.
That was worse than the duck and cover.
Oh, yeah.
So you eventually graduated high school. Yeah.
Yeah.
As a Columbia High bomber.
Mm-hmm.
And then you went to WSU.
Yes, I did.
Right. And what did you go for?
Well, when I went to Wazoo, I knew, as I said earlier, that I wanted to be a chemist. And so I went up there and I took the chemistry courses. And for a couple years, I took nuclear chemistry and radiochemistry. And there were some funny stories on that, like when I was my first year up there, and I hadn't worked at Hanford yet and didn't know what the word hot meant. And hot meant radioactive out here. And so somebody went to get a piece of glassware, and they said, "Don't touch it, it's hot." And he thought it was radioactive, and he just dropped it on the floor. And so that did happen. That was funny. We even had a couple. Well, we had a reactor up there. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you knew that or not, but we, for instance, took gold foil and irradiated it, and then that's one of our projects, and we'd have to go back and determine its half-life and so on. We did that to calibrate our instruments, things like that, and then our senior year we had radiochemistry, which was more like theoretical physics or something like that. And our instructor, I always got a kick out of him. He'd give us an exam, and he'd have about 10 questions on it, and we'd have an hour to do it in, you know. And pretty soon he'd say, how many are halfway through with the exam? No hands. Well, and eventually he'd get down to how many have got one done? And he'd get no hands. And he'd say, well, okay, let's make this a take-home test. And you take it home, and you spent the whole weekend doing it. I mean, but, and then we had to, in the one where we would have all the instrumentation and so forth and did all of our experiments, we had to do longhand procedures. And that would be like 10, 15, 20 pages long every week. We had to do one. And sometimes we'd laugh and joke that, you know, the further they could throw them up a step, the better your grade. But most of them really were more interested in why you didn't get the correct result, and so your error portion of the write-up was very important and critical. But I enjoyed chemistry up there. And of course, after school, you know, there were a lot of things you could do with chemistry.
Such as?
Oh, this was a guy down the hall. He and I were in the same class, but he made some ammonium triiodide, and he painted it on the rubber tips of the seats in the toilet, and they would dry, and then somebody like at 2 o'clock in the morning would have to go in there and sit, you know, and it'd blow up. And sometimes he'd squirt it in the key locks. You put your key in there, and the friction would set it off.
It wasn't like a large explosion, right? Just
No.
kind of like a little, but enough probably to startle somebody.
Oh, especially in the morning when you're still asleep.
Oh, wow.
But yeah. And I tried to make some rockets there, and I set one off in the room, and the ceiling was all speckled.
Oh, wow.
But
That
got
was like that. A lot of fun, huh?
Oh, it was fun. Yeah, I enjoyed that up there.
And so when did you graduate?
Graduated in '62.
62. Okay, and then you started at Hanford Labs.
Right. Actually, I went up to the Seattle World's Fair up there, and then I came back and went to work. So it was in June of '62 that I started out here, and I was in the Tech Grad program, which started out at the 300 area for me.
Okay.
You were interviewed, and depending upon what your choice was, would depend on where you started work. But I started work in the 300 area, and the PRTR reactor was there. And I worked in the water lab. And I also worked out at the 100K area, and they had a water lab out there. And so I had to substitute for the guy that was responsible for those when he'd go on vacation or whatever. And so I'd spend a half a day at PRTR and the other half of the day at K. And I'd pick up the car down at the Federal Building and check it out, and I'd have it all day for my activities.
And what did PRTR stand for?
Plutonium Recycle Test Reactor. And the one big thing I remember about that, it used heavy water for the moderator and so forth. But there were jugs, and I mean jugs of heavy water lining the hallways throughout that whole reactor building. I mean, and that stuff is very expensive.
And what was the job of that reactor? What did it do?
It was supposed to determine how you can recycle plutonium in a reactor, and rather than enriching uranium or some other technique. And so it was real nice that way, but they did, and I can't remember exactly what the mistake was in there, but they got it all contaminated. So it didn't last much longer.
Okay.
They came out with the FFTF and stuff like that. And A lot of people. And I had a father-in-law back then that was a heating and ventilating engineer, and DOE kept chiding Battelle down there to get going and get that reactor going, you know. And they had to send out the prints and stuff like that to the commercial reactor manufacturers and get their input so that we could demonstrate something that they were interested in. And oftentimes, he said, the requests were 180 degrees apart. So it really slowed them down to do that, and they finally gave it to Westinghouse, who finished it.
So you said you worked at PRTR and then at the water lab.
Yeah, they had a water lab in
And-
PRTR. They'd take samples of the reactor or effluent and stuff like that, and
And do what with it?
analyze it to see if there's radiation in it, if there's any cross-contamination, or if there's impurities in it, because sometimes impurities can corrode or whatever, and so you want to make sure those are taken care of.
So how long did you work this kind of split shift between PRTR and the water lab?
Well, I worked in the water lab at PRTR the whole time.
Oh, okay, sorry.
That's okay. But yeah, I did that. He went on vacation 3 times or so I probably had a month's work there.
And what other jobs did you have out at Hanford?
Oh, I had a chance to work at B Reactor, as a matter of fact. I interviewed out there, and the manager out there made it sound like utopia, you know. You're going to do this, you're going to write these reports, and your name's going to be out there in blinking lights. I mean, he didn't say that, but he made it sound grand and glorious. And I thought, you know, I just had a gut feeling that don't go to work there. And a smart move, because he shut it down. But so I went to 234-5 building, which is the plutonium building.
Mm-hmm.
And I had 3 main jobs there. The first one was in the process laboratory, and there I got to handle plutonium, and that's quite a thrill. And then we did a lot of analysis for operations so that they can control the process and so forth. Then I was asked to updo the carbon machine, and I tore it apart, and I was getting ready to put it back together and make some modifications. And the shift manager at Dash 5, he ended up with diabetes, and so they had to remove him from the shift for a period of time while he got that under control. So they sent me down there to take his place. Well, I never had worked with union before. Now, I don't know if you guys have or not, but I had to make a transfer from a tank to one of the cribs outside. And so I couldn't find the operator, so I did it. Well, I got my grievance. And I lost that one, obviously. But you know, I've had a couple other grievances too, and I won those. But but that was interesting to do that. And so I was working shift work doing that. And we had to make the buttons, the plutonium buttons. And we'd get the plutonium feed material from either Purex or Radox. And then we'd run it through the plant, and we had a screw system there, and you could backflow the gases over it and stuff like that to come up with your product. And we ended up with plutonium fluoride, and then we'd have a crucible that we'd put that stuff in, and we'd add a little iodine and calcium and heat it up, and then the reaction would take place, and the plutonium would go to the bottom into a little, I guess you'd call it kind of like a little cup in the bottom, so that it would all be in there. Now, this is something that I had never thought of until I was in the burial grounds, but those crucibles were made out of ceramic material, and they were manufactured by Coors Beer. They were, and I guess they still are, one of the top qualified manufacturers of that material. And so that stuff back then was classified secret and so forth. And so we had a lot of waste from Coors in Colorado, which is non-rad, go to the burial grounds because it was classified. So if a lot of people think, everything out there is rad, well, that's not so. But we did a lot with that. And then from there, I went down to the research laboratory, and I had to make plutonium chloride material for Rocky Flats. And I have no idea what they did with it. It was one of those things, here it is, we give it to them, and we don't talk about it.
You don't ask too many questions.
Right, but we used phosgene gas, and we had these in cylinders, and you'd heat it up, and then you'd pass the gas through it, and it would change the oxide to the chloride. Now, phosgene gas is very poisonous, and that used to be one of those trench gases they had during, the First World War, stuff like that. And it's supposed to smell, and it does smell like freshly mown hay. And if you don't want to breathe it, that's for sure. But every so often a whiff would come by, and I did have a couple slight smells of it.
Did it make you sick?
No.
Oh, okay.
It wasn't that concentrated, I guess I'd say.
Is it a neural agent? Is that what it does? And how does plutonium chloride differ? Does it differ? What is it like? It's not a liquid. Is it a solid or powder? What kind of form is it?
It's a powder.
It's a powder. Okay.
It's chloride's got more atoms in it. Not atoms. Neutrons and protons than fluoride does, and so it's a lot different from it. Now, the thing that I didn't have a problem with it, but it was my first time in dealing with kg quantities of plutonium. And we had holes in the hood so that we could put these canisters in there. And I had something like, 20 kgs or so of plutonium in there. And I'm sitting there thinking, I hope those critical mass people know what they're talking about. Because, you think you're okay as long as you don't do something, but if you drop it, what do you do or whatever. And that led to other questions, because eventually when I was in operations, I got to have all the combinations and stuff for the vaults that stored plutonium. And you could only have 2 people go in a vault at once. And that's because we are contained of water. Our body has a lot of water in it, and so, that's a good moderator. And so you don't want too many people going around and stuff. And then, of course, the cans are about the size of a tuna fish can, and they had them on posts in there and in safe. Go ahead.
Oh, so sorry. I'm just curious about this water thing. What role would the water play around plutonium?
Neutrons. It moderates the neutrons.
Okay. So how would so you could start a chain reaction then with enough
Yes.
water in the okay.
Yeah, and you didn't want that.
No,
No.
you usually oh well, you only want it when it's intentional.
Yeah, like in a reactor or whatever. Now, one other thing that was interesting is they'd had a criticality shortly before I went over there at Dash 5, and so we didn't have a way to recycle plutonium. And so a lot of plutonium went into storage, not just into vaults, because we ran out of that. And we had igloos on the other side of West Area. There were 7 igloos there, and we stored plutonium in there. And periodically, when I was on shift on that, taking that supervisor's place, then we would go out there and we'd check it and see what's going on. And in one place, in one of the igloos, these were left over from the Army, by the way.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, when you say igloo, what kind of structure are you referring to?
It's basically a metal building that's in an arch shape. It's not square shaped.
Oh, like a Quonset hut.
Yeah, like a Quonset hut.
Okay.
And then, but it's covered with dirt.
Okay.
And
so kind of like either built into a side or just kind of so it blends in. So it's insulated, right?
well, yeah, but it's, the military was out here for a long time and they kept ammo and stuff in there. And so, you wanted them to be pretty well protected.
Sure.
And then the front of it, for instance, was made out of concrete.
Okay.
And there was a door in there and so on. We went to radiation monitoring to get some support, and they were not accommodating, let's put it that way. So I and 2 operators went out there, and we found that there was some liquid organic material that was packaged in there. Apparently it had fizzed, and it had come up and eaten its way through the plastic barrier, and then it just kind of rolled onto the floor, and then it went all the way over into the gutter, and that was pretty high in plutonium, let's put it that way. And the mice had gotten in there and tracked it all over.
Oh.
And their droppings were hot. And I and another guy got contaminated in there. You had to wear 2 pairs of rubber gloves, and then you had to wear a thick latex glove on top of that. And the moment you touched that organic, it would go right through. So you started peeling the gloves off.
Wow. You mean it would just eat right through the glove?
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
So 2 of us went back with a very minimal count on our hands, and radiation monitoring raised a fit on it. And I said, well, we asked you, but you wouldn't take it. So from that time on, we had monitors out there.
What happened to the rats? Were their bodies found, or did somehow maybe go up further in the food chain, or
No, we never found a rat.
just,
Or mouse.
Just the tracks and the droppings?
Mainly the droppings. And I got an idea that stuff killed them. I mean, if it goes right through gloves.
Yeah. Wow.
So, in fact, years later, after I retired and I went back to work out there, I had somebody call me up, and we went out there to look where all those had been and stuff, because they've all been removed. There's no igloos out there anymore. So,
And was there any trace of them or any trace of the accident out there at that point?
no, it had been decontaminated.
And where exactly was this?
It's west of West Area. There's an Army Loop Road that goes in back of West Area.
Mm-hmm.
And it was on the other side of the Army Loop Road, and there was a fence around it.
Is that right up against the mountain then? Or
No, it's flat out there.
Oh, okay.
If when you go on the highway, the
Yeah.
public highway, and you go up there, and you can see some of the buildings and stuff. If you look close, you'll see where there had been some. I don't want to say buildings, but some foxholes or something like that that the military had done, and it was just in back of that is
Oh,
where
okay.
it was. And
Interesting. And so after the research lab in 234-5Z, where did you go from there?
I went to Purex. First job I had at Purex was in operations, and there was the main supervisor, and then he had two that supported him, and I hired in over there as one of those. And the building was divided into the west side and the east side for the two, and I had the head end, which was where the fuel dissolution occurred, where we had the uranium facilities outside, the liquid uranium, because we didn't make solids back then. And then we also had the stack and so forth out back, and so all that was something I had to get familiar with. And
Sorry, what was the stack?
it's a 200-foot chimney, I guess you'd call it. And that way, whenever you dissolved or whatever, and you had off-gassing and so forth, it'd go out that 200-foot stack. And that gas would go through a glass filter. And that way, you didn't have radiation going through except the radiation that was in a gaseous form, because nothing will stop that pretty much. And iodine was one that would go out that way. Now, speaking of stacks, when they built B and T plant, they did not have filters on them. The stack was 200. All those stacks are about 200 feet tall. And so when they dissolved on the old buildings, because they didn't have filters and stuff, they had to do it when the wind was proper. And so there were, and then after a while, of course, the machinery and stuff in the plant would corrode a little bit, and so you could get dust particles or whatever coming out the stack. And there were times where I wasn't working out there then, but I was told that they had to put on booties when the bus was out there to walk into the building, and then they took them off because the particulates out there were bad. And Purex had some of that to a certain extent, because their first step going up into the building was about even with the asphalt. So something had been covered.
Were B and T retrofitted with the filters after?
Yes,
after
they were.
invented?
Only theirs were sand filters.
Oh, okay.
And
How did the glass filter work? I imagine it wasn't a sheet of glass.
oh no, it was kind of like insulation in your house, only it was beaucoup thick.
Oh, okay.
I don't remember how thick it was, but sometimes chemicals would hang up on it because they'd be in particulate form or whatever. And because Purex was a nitrate facility, well, all of them were nitrate facilities, because the bulk of the materials would be soluble in the nitrate form. And so it would catch like sodium nitrate or something like that. And our filters over there, when I was working over there, started to plug, and so we had to add another bay for filtration, and you still let it go over the old one, because you want to use it up as much as you can, and then it go into the new one. And
How would those be cleaned, or would
they weren't.
Oh, okay. What would they do? Just collapse the stack and like, bring
Oh
the stack
no,
down?
we just added on to the filter system.
Oh, okay.
At Purex, that's all we did.
Interesting.
And at B&T, that was a sand filter, and so they added some HEPA filters to them later on.
And so what? How long did you work as a operations supervisor at Purex?
Oh, probably a year or so.
Okay.
The laboratory manager came down and asked for me to go to work in the laboratory. And we talked about it and so forth, and he said there was a pay raise in it. And so, you know, and I went down there and I went on D shift as a shift supervisor in the laboratory.
In which at Purex?
The Purex process laboratory.
Laboratory. Okay.
And so there I had about 10 people working for me in the laboratory. And operations would take their samples, and we had a dumb waiter that went down to the sample floor, and they'd stick the samples on there and bring it up to the lab, and then we'd analyze it.
And what would you be analyzing for?
Well, for instance, in the feed, we would be analyzing for the uranium, plutonium, and neptunium, because those were the products. And you want to know, if you start out with, say, 1 pound of plutonium, that you end up with a pound at the end. You don't want to go out the tank farms or whatever. So that's one of the things. The other things is to you strip the fission products away from it and so forth, and so you're cleaning it up as it goes through the plant. And that was very important. And if they had plant problems or something like that, we might get special samples and so forth. And I can remember one sample that went out to one of the cribs that for the off-gas system, and apparently it bubbled over or something, because it was pretty yellow when we got it, plus it was pretty hot in terms of radiation. And so, you know, you have to tell them what's going on, and then they'll take care of it. We eventually, well, I had 3 jobs there, actually. I did that, and then I went to day shift as a day shift supervisor, because when our manager left, our day shift supervisor was bumped up to manager, so I took his job. And then later on, the research chemist that was there, he left and got another job off-site, and so I took his job. And I did that. I worked in that lab, well, counting the tech grad program and so forth, I probably worked in that lab 6 years to 8 years, somewheres in that time frame. But
this was at the
Purex process, yeah. And eventually, you know, while I was working there, waste management was the buzzword, you know. That was the new thing. And so B-Plant became the center point for that. And then, so we started getting set up to also analyze B-Plant samples, and they'd have to bring them to us.
Sorry, when you say waste management is the new buzzword, what do you mean, like there was a new recognition of the waste products being generated at Hanford, or
yes,
or how did that change from what had been happening before? What was this new focus, and where did it come from?
Well, I don't know where all of it came from, but the main reason is to keep track of that, and to try to separate some of the higher beta gamma emitters, which could assist you in high-level waste determinations and things like that. Now, high-level waste is a unique word, and transuranic is a unique word. Transuranic basically means if it's greater than uranium in the periodic chart, it's transuranic. And so that waste eventually, not at the beginning, went down to New Mexico into their caverns.
Into Carlsbad.
And then the high-level waste means that it's the first cycle waste from processing fuels, and so the bulk of the beta gamma products are in there.
And early on, that had not been before the Purex process and redox were that some of that waste had just been processed a bit, but then dumped.
Well,
right?
it was separated from the transuranics, and then it was neutralized and put out the tank farms.
Right. But it was still high level waste in the tank farms.
Not necessarily.
Okay.
See, it has to be from the first cycle waste. You run the fuels through, and on the first cycle waste, you separate the high level waste from the transuranics and uranics as far as that goes. And so anything separated after that is not high level waste.
Okay.
Now, for instance, and this may sound funny, at FFTF they had some reactor trees that were in the reactor, and they got contaminant activated from the neutrons, hitting steel and stuff like that. It'll absorb it, and you get cobalt-60 and all sorts of stuff. Well, that stuff, could read, and I'm making this number up, say 100,000 rad, okay?
Mm-hmm.
That's low-level waste. The intensity has nothing to do with what it is.
So that was going to be my next question. So high level waste, you said, is the waste, the product after the first pass.
Right.
But so even if you strip out the uranics and transuranics, that waste could still be hot, but it would not be high level waste.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's a term that refers to the product at a specific state in time, not the level of contamination or radiation level of the actual item.
Same thing with the spent fuel. A spent fuel, you think of it being in the reactor for a period of time so that it burns up the uranium-235 or whatever. And in this case, it doesn't really matter as far as how long it's been irradiated. If you put it in the reactor for 5 minutes, it's been irradiated.
So it's spent fuel.
Yeah, and it might be cold enough to touch, but that doesn't get rid of it as spent fuel.
Mm.
See, some of these definitions are, I guess you'd say they're politically driven.
Yeah, as someone who comes from a history background and not a nuclear chemistry background, the use of the term high level waste brings up something else. Doesn't seem to be the best descriptor for this specific. If you were to say maybe first pass waste, or because high level makes you think that it's important waste, not necessarily that it's just the waste from the first run through the reactor.
Well, it is important because in the spent fuel, when you separate that out, you're going to have mixed fission products that are hotsy-totsy. For instance...
Is that a technical term?
No, that's...
Sorry.
That's a good question.
Couldn't resist.
But no. For instance, at B plant, they would recover the cesium and the strontium,
Mm-hmm.
and they'd send us over some cesium in a 100-pound pig, for shielding. Well, you'd have a 0.5 ml of cesium in there, which is a strong gamma.
Mm-hmm.
And so in order for us to play with that, I shouldn't use the term play, but to do the analytical analysis and so forth, we'd have to get a pipe that was, say, 10 feet long and put it through the handle so that the two people that were carrying that 100-pound pig around were minimizing their exposure,
Sure.
because even through that 100-pound pig, it was pretty hot.
Wow.
So, yeah. Now, strontium's not quite so bad because it's a beta emitter,
Okay.
but they're still both heat. So, and of course they added the facilities over at B plant to encapsulate those materials. And if you went over, they looked almost like standard fuel elements or something, and they glowed blue.
Is it that? What's that type of radiation?
Cherenkov.
Cherenkov radiation.
Right.
So sorry, and when you're saying B plant, you mean B reactor?
No,
Like,
B plant.
B plant. Okay, and what is B plant?
B plant was the first. T plant was the first separation facility to separate plutonium from spent fuels,
Okay.
and it was a precipitation process.
And that's with the cribs and the pools, right? With the constant chemical refining of or separation of the plutonium.
Right. They precipitated it and then went on with it
Okay.
and recovered it. So yeah, that was very important.
And how does B plant differ?
It's almost the same as T plant. T
Okay.
plant was the first one built, and so they made it a little bit different so that they could do more research or studies or whatever with it than B.
But it was still one of those long canyon buildings.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Okay.
They're roughly what, 3 football fields long or something
Yeah,
like that.
yeah.
I mean, they're huge.
And where was that located?
B plant was probably a mile away from Purex.
Okay.
And T plant was probably a mile away, more or less, from Dash 5, the plutonium building.
Okay. Okay.
And I wouldn't be 100%
Sure.
in a mile. I mean,
So we talked a bit about high-level waste and that kind of specific definition, and you'd started to talk about spent fuels, and I think maybe the problem with that terminology, or how that terminology could cause issues or something. I wonder if we could go back to that.
okay. Issues how?
Well, I don't know. You started to mention that spent fuel was referred to a specific
Oh yeah,
process.
it was just like high level waste or whatever else. If it was in a reactor for a short period of time, maybe it's touchable, whatever. But it's still spent fuel, and so
Okay.
you've got to treat it like spent fuel, and
Oh,
it has
okay.
to go to a geologic repository and all that stuff.
Oh, okay, okay. I see. So it's a very large, kind of all-encompassing definition that doesn't necessarily tell you how long it was in the reactor, and how much of the uranium has been processed and things like that.
Right, because if you leave it in the reactor for a shorter period of time, as versus longer, you come out with fuels grade plutonium.
Right.
If you leave it in longer than that, then you end up with reactor grade plutonium. And one is more amenable to nuclear devices.
Which one is that?
The what did I call it?
You said there was fuel and reactor grade. Fuel grade.
Yeah,
and
fuel grade.
Fuel grade.
Not fuel grade. It's well, yeah, I guess that works. Fuel grade, but it's not reactor grade. I mean, it's one that you can use in bombs.
Okay.
Weapons grade. That's what it
Weapons grade.
is. Weapons grade.
Okay. So there's weapons grade and reactor grade.
Yes.
Okay. When did you start work on the thorium campaign?
Oh, we had 2 of them there. One of them was a short period to demonstrate that we could do it. And then the next one was to demonstrate that we could meet the requirements that was set upon us.
And that was for the Navy. right? For the Navy
for
reactors.
Rickover.
Yeah, Admiral Rickover.
And I'll say this: whenever he spoke, you jumped.
Why?
I mean, he had the power.
Mm.
When he said something, you did it. There was no ifs, ands, or buts. Now, the Thoria campaign, and actually, if we had Thoria reactors, that might be another topic. But we never had those out there. Well, I guess we did, because we did irradiate some. But Rickover wanted some uranium-233, and so that's what we made. Because Thoria, when you irradiate it, will go up to uranium-233, which is also fissile. You can make bombs, it's weapons grade, or again, if you overdo it, it can be non-weapons grade. But we had to do recalibrate the laboratory in order to handle that material, and you use the same chemicals basically, but you have to use them in a different way, and we had to analyze it a different way. And I became, since I was the research chemist there, we had to have large samples of the product so that we could analyze for all the impurities and so forth that they wanted. And consequently, we had a cabinet that we had in the building, or in the laboratory, that could handle kg quantities of uranium-233. And I had some critical mass bottles, which was product bottles that they used down in operations. And when we accumulated enough 233, I would fill one of those jugs. And I put a little plastic mixer in the bottom and put it on a magnetic plate, and then we'd mix it up and so forth after we put it together. And then I had to take enough sample out of there because it was product, just like we did down below, and analyze that and make sure it met all the requirements.
And what is the advantage for using thorium instead of uranium or plutonium for the reactor? Why the push for thorium?
Well, Rickover wanted it.
Okay.
He wanted it for the Navy.
And why? What's the advantage to using thorium?
Well, if you have an impurity of uranium-232 in there, and you could make fuels for submarine reactors or whatever, and if you did that, you had to have pretty clean separated materials, because that 232 is a very hard gamma, and it would go from gamma to gamma to gamma, and so you would have more than enough coming from it. And so if you kept it long enough, you'd have something that could probably be lethal. So it was kind of its own self-control.
In what way?
It'd be lethal.
The product would? Or the
product would, because the uranium-232 is decaying into these hot daughters.
Oh, okay. Okay. And how is thorium made?
Thorium is in the earth.
Okay.
And so it's a natural element. And then when you throw a neutron into it, it makes it's thorium-232, and you add a neutron, it becomes thorium-233, which decays to uranium-233.
Oh, okay.
So it's kind of like uranium-238 getting a neutron and making Pu-239.
Gotcha. Okay. And how long did you work on these thorium campaigns?
Oh, they were very short. I think it was probably around 6 months long, something like that. The demo was just a short period of time. I don't know, weeks maybe at the most. But the other one was a lot longer.
And then you mentioned right around this time that waste management started to become kind of a new hot issue, or maybe hot's not the best word to use, but it started gaining a lot of attention, and so you moved to waste management, right, from Purex.
Yes, I transferred also. I went to an engineering group because they make more money. Back then they made more money than a chemist. So, but yes, and there, boy, I'll tell you, I was at B Plant, which was the operations facility, and I wrote monthly reports, management reports. I wrote 2 of those every month. I mean, one of each. And then I wrote quarterly reports for burial grounds, gas emissions, and liquid discharges. And then I also wrote the tank farm reports. And so I had to be involved with a lot of that. And the funny thing is, my boss called me into his office after I'd done that for a few years. He says, "Guess what? I got a proposition for you." And I says, "Oh, what's that?" And he says, "Well, it's one you ought to say yes to." And so he said, "Engineering wants your job and wants you to go along with it." So I transferred from operations to engineering, and that's how I got involved in the engineering aspect
of waste management.
Yeah.
And so, how long did you work as a waste management engineer?
Oh, from 1971 about until 2012, I guess.
Wow, that's quite a long time. What were some of the can you describe kind of your work as a waste management engineer? What did you do out there, and what significant accomplishments or setbacks did you have?
Well, we had, for instance, with the double shell tanks, one of the A farm tanks, A102AY, I think it was. I could be off on that, but we had to analyze the material that went in there and keep it below a certain concentration of sodium and so on, to keep it in a good, safe condition.
Sure.
And then the other tanks, we had to keep track of the material that went in there. For instance, we had one tank that tended to get a lot of the first cycle waste or whatever, and we had to make sure that the fissile material in there was according to par. So we had requirements and so forth. When we went out to the liquid discharges to the ground, for instance, you had to make those as low as you could. And I remember DOE asked me to tell them what after they ran it through a process and cleaned up the discharge quite a bit, they asked me to tell them what it was going to be like in 20 years. And I said, well, here's what we put in and blah, 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 blah. And so you're not going to see much change out in the crib because it's already so contaminated. And so they came back and said, well, forget the old stuff, just do the new stuff. So that's what we did. But sometimes the operation would have a problem with it, and it would discharge some radioactive materials to the environment.
From the tank to the
No, from the building.
Oh, from the building to the environment. So not from the building to the tank, but
Now over at one of the ponds, they put up scarecrows and stuff to keep the ducks and stuff out, and they got used to that, and so then they started with a shotgun effect. It was an air gun or something, and that worked for a while, but then they got used to that, and so finally they had to put a net over it. So Yeah, Mother Nature will get used to most anything.
Yeah.
And so that was a problem.
Um, what about emissions from the tank farms? I wonder if you could talk about that.
We never really noticed a lot of emissions from the tank farms when I was working in it. I remember a lot of the tanks did not have filters on them. And in the middle of winter, because they're liquid tanks, you know, you're going to have high humidity and coming out the breather. And so there was what looked like steam coming out. And somebody in DOE saw that. And so we had to hook up everything up to an exhaust system. But we never really had much of a problem unless liquid burped out of a tank or whatever.
And did that happen?
Yes, it did. Not in some of those farms, and it was pretty hot. In fact, one of them was so hot that, rightly so, the manager over that covered it with some soil so it wouldn't get airborne and so forth after it was on the ground. So I remember they called me up, and I had to go out to the building, and we put in a concrete burial box into the trench, and we had to have it such that they could scoop up that material and go over and dump it into the concrete box so that we could tell the public that it had been contained and so forth. But I remember going to work at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and I worked till noon or something like that. My boss says, "How long you been out here?" And I told him, and he says, "Well, go home." So, but that happened every so often, not a lot, but, and there's some stories I put in my tank farm, or not my tank farm, my burial ground report, that there was they used to transfer sometimes overground, and they still do.
What do you mean? Transfer waste.
Waste overground instead of underground.
Okay.
And Radox is, say, half a mile away from the S Farm complex, and so they could read it over there, which is quite a distance away. Mm-hmm. And so they had to rush over there and pump cold water through it and get the readings down. So
pump cold water through
the transfer line.
Oh, okay. And a half-mile transfer line seems...
No, that wasn't a transfer line.
Oh.
The tank farm is over here, and Radox is over here, and they can read it over at Radox.
Oh, they can read... Oh, okay. I see. I see.
Yeah. Now, what we did when I was in engineering there is we would calculate the volume of liquid that would be in a pipe when you're transferring. And you could transfer from east area to west area, which is a few miles. But you had to calculate how much was going to be in the lines. And so when you transferred, you would look at the drop in the tank, and you'd look at the rise in the other tank, and there's going to be a delay because of what's being held up into the piping. So we had to do that. And one time, the liquid went down real fast, and it went up real slow in the receiving tank, and we had to shut it off and find out what's what. And when we could take pictures inside the tanks and stuff like that, and so we went in. Well, the solid material in the tank that we were removing the liquid from had an annulus of solids around it. And so instead of being the full diameter of the tank that we were pumping out, it was the inside. And so they didn't match up because, a small radius of waste versus the tank, which is the full radius. And so we had a lot of troubles with stuff like that. And we used to take a lot of pictures in the tank farms.
How would you take a picture of the inside of the tank?
You get a rigid pipe, if you will, and hook the camera up to it, and then you can remotely set the frames down there and the flash, and then you can hold it and or support it, whatever, and rotate it. And so as it goes around in a circle, you'll get pictures of it. And the other thing that we did was put gas. You'd put the camera, wrap it in plastic so it won't get contaminated, but you can't do that with the lens. That would distort and stuff. So you had air being blown over the lens to keep it free and clean.
Wow.
And so you had little pieces of instrument pipe, I guess you'd say, that would do that.
Kind of spritz air across it.
But we did that in the caissons too, in the burial grounds.
Wow. So, and the radiation in the tank wouldn't contaminate the film or any of the mechanical components of the camera or anything like that?
No, because they're encased in that plastic.
Mm. And then so the camera was then safe to work with too, right? Once you remove the plastic and everything.
Right.
That's really interesting.
We had almost a full-time photographer out there that did that. A lot of those were his ideas.
Wow.
So
That's quite something.
now I wrote a history book on the tank farms.
For
Yeah.
DOE or just in general?
Just in general, so I wrote the document, and it's 90% of it or more is tables of what went where and all that sort of stuff, from tank A to tank B to tank C and so on.
And did you do this as a private citizen? Did you do this while you were working on the tank farms or
Oh, I did it out there.
Oh, okay.
And I was in waste management, and I had all those different projects. I had the tank farms, the burial grounds, the cribs, ponds, and ditches, and the gas emissions, and so the environmental group said, "Well, I'm doing their work." So I lost all those reports except for the burial grounds. Which is fine, because there was more work in the burial grounds to do than in the other. So, but I enjoyed the writing that history book. But as I went around the building, there was umpteen secretaries. Back then, no computers, for us. And so I'd say, "You want to do some work for me?" And sure. And I'd show them those tables, and no. So it took me a long time to get them typed up. And then it was decided that it was too sensitive a material. And so they wouldn't let me publish it, but I could make operational copies. So John Glenn, the astronaut, the senator and stuff, he was at a meeting, and I wasn't there, so this is purely secondhand or more. But there was a Battelle document that was in the same category. They'd done the work on it, but they didn't think they should publish it, So he found out about that, and so he asked the people there, he says, "So what other documents are you hiding?" And so they said, "Anderson's document." So I had 30 days to publish it. And that's how it got published. Which is okay, but it didn't have the scrutiny it should have had. But I put a cover letter on it that showed that. I had a lot of projects where you do that. I had to look at the inventory, or the MUF. They called it a MUF back then. Material unaccounted for, at -5.
As in radioactive material?
as in plutonium.
Plutonium.
Yeah, because when you got kg quantities of stuff, you're never going to be down to the gnat's eyebrow. But I was asked to make a report on that, and I did. And since most of it was buried and so forth, we'll probably never know how good the numbers were. But
Right, some of it made it into the waste stream, right? In some form or another.
yeah, and sometimes it might not have even existed to begin with.
So I wrote some things for me to ask you about here. So I'm just going to kind of go down the list, if that's all right with you. And if we've already covered it, please feel free to tell me. She had on here tank farms and emissions from tank farms.
Oh, we went through that
Okay.
because
Right.
they didn't have HEPAs and so on.
Right. And what about waste generator requirements?
That's on radioactive solid waste. We couldn't do an audit, but we could do assessments. And one of the requirements that DOE put on us was that you're to check and find out what's going on. So we that was in DOE Order 5820, I think it was. So we set up a program, and I used to visit all the DOE sites that sent us radioactive waste. They could be colleges, they could be other research laboratories, and so forth. And so once a year, I and another guy, and sometimes a couple more, would go to the different generating sites and verify that they're indeed meeting our requirements for disposal. And we would actually look at the waste, not just say yea verily and bless it. We had to go in, and we found some interesting things in some of that. We found a Coke bottle, Coke can I guess it was, in a radioactive waste, and that's not supposed to be in there. And then down at 300 area, we found a wooden box that had the janitor's materials in it. And, why would that be in there? Well, he didn't know what to do with it. But
when in doubt, put it to where, put it in the garbage, right?
That's right. And so we had some oddball stuff like that. One of the biggest problems we had was lead, because they came out with hazardous requirements as well as radioactive requirements. Well, lead, if you do the test on it, the laboratory test, it's a hazardous material.
Sure.
And I remember we had a lot of people in one of the laboratories that said, well, I've been using it to prop my door open for 20 years and it hadn't killed me yet. And
You're talking about, and what? Like it's just a piece of lead? Like a lead doorstop or something? Or
no, just a chunk, a lead brick.
just a lead brick?
Just a plain old lead brick.
Where would one get a lead brick?
Oh, out at Hanford, they're everywhere.
Okay.
I mean, you use them for shielding mainly. But,
Okay.
and so, yeah, you get them everywhere.
Of course, now that would be almost unheard of, right? To have have lead bricks on the floor as
Right.
door stops.
And we had lead glass, too.
Right.
Leaded glass. And so we took some leaded glass and analyzed it, and it's also hazardous. It meets or fails the test, whatever you want to call it.
Sure.
And we even went over to, it wasn't Macy's then, but it was the people that owned that facility before, and we got some Steuben glass. And that is the most crystal clear glass I think there is, but it's high in lead. So the problem is, for instance, if you like wine, you may not want to leave it in there too long.
Mm-hmm.
And we even called Steuben up, and they said, "Oh yeah, we know it." So,
Wow. Um, another thing here is concern about hydrogen explosions.
we had that in the burial grounds as well as the tank farms, and radioactive materials can decay and ionize other things, organics for instance, and tear them apart, and so you can generate hydrogen. And so you don't want that to build up in your, say, a waste drum of solid waste. And so we had to come up with some techniques to use so that we could mitigate any chance of hydrogen buildup in a waste system. For instance, we ended up with catalyst beads that we put in solid waste in a screen. We screened it on and put it together so it'd be on top, and that's where hydrogen likes to go and stuff. And so then we also put clips, vent clips, on the side of a drum that would be good enough to allow hydrogen to weep out, but it wouldn't be good enough to let the plutonium out or whatever. So we did all these different things to.
Did you ever have a hydrogen explosion?
No.
Oh, okay. So this was just a concern based on a probability, but not an actual event.
That's correct.
Do you know of any hydrogen explosion in a waste tank?
Not in a waste tank, but that reactor back east did have hydrogen in it.
Which 3 Mile?
3 Mile Island, yeah.
I see. And then so another bullet here is trenches for reactors.
Okay. Now, we started this a long time ago, but the Navy has reactors in subs, and they also have them in the flat tops.
The aircraft carriers.
Aircraft carriers.
Right. Oh, so this is the burial grounds for the reactors.
Right, and so they come from the shipyard over on the west side of the state.
Mm-hmm.
And then they put them on a barge because they're so heavy, and they bring them up to the Columbia, and then they bring them to the dock just south of 300 area. Is that right? Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah.
And then they transport it on a vehicle that has multi tires, and then they travel at about 5 miles an hour or so and take it out to the burial grounds. And so we have all those reactors out there, and if you look at them, the outside of that is the hull from the sub, for instance.
Right.
And then they put a plate on the front and back, and
How did that start?
well, the Navy. Well, we had the treaty with Russia. What was it? SALT treaty or.
Strategic arms limitation.
And so Russia had to know how many missiles were available in the military, and so when they're in dock and they're tearing them apart or whatever, they leave the missile ports open so the satellites that go over can look in and say, they're clean. And they can still count them in the burial grounds even though there's nothing there except the reactor. But we have to meet that, and that's politics. I won't try to second guess that.
Sure, that's fine. there's a place for politics.
Now, the old reactors out along the Columbia River, there was a lot of talk about putting those in the burial ground too. Mm-hmm. And there's all sorts of techniques, and originally they were going to bring them, but then they decided to let them decay a while and then maybe bring them over. I don't know.
Or who knows, maybe they'll become part of a national park
Could be.
someday. And then the last one here is something I'm familiar with: environmental impact statements.
We wrote our first burial environmental impact statement. It was in early 70s, I think it was.
Right, that would have been right after the creation of the EPA.
And so we did that, and then later on, Battelle had to do them.
Uh-huh.
And so then we did a pre-report, or I don't want to call it a pre-report, a report that had the information in it, and let Battelle run with it.
Mm-hmm.
And so we worked on a lot of those too. But that would include, again, the burial ground. Well, it depends what the EIS is on.
Mm-hmm.
But if it was on the burial grounds, and one of them was on high-level waste. I remember that, in tank farms, I think it was. So yeah.
So the EISs then covered the different waste management activities that were going on in the out at Hanford.
Yes.
And so what kind of work did that take to put together an EIS for high level waste or for tank farm remediation?
It took months. You had to estimate what was going to happen and how it was, and then you had to look at different scenarios. But we couldn't say what the final scenario was, or the conclusion.
Just because you didn't know, or?
No, that was Battelle's problem.
Okay.
Let them decide what's what. And so that's the way it went.
Did you find yourself spending a lot of time doing EIS work?
Whenever they happened, yeah. Otherwise, it was kind of not there. I mean, we had to obey by them. Once they were issued, we had to meet their requirements.
Sure. And so from the early 70s then until you said you retired for good in 2012, where was most of your work centered?
From about 1971 on, it was in the burial grounds.
Okay, this is the 200 area
Burial grounds.
And here it says that you retired in 96.
I physically retired in 96, and then they called me back, and I worked until 2012.
Okay.
So I almost worked 50 years.
Wow. How did things change for you beginning in the late 80s after the production shutdown? Did you find your job changed, or did the outlook of your coworkers or your bosses or the site change?
Actually, we had more work because of the inspections we had to do and things like that, and so it didn't cut the work.
Just got busier for waste management.
Yeah, I mean the requirements got more and more, and so we had that. Now that doesn't include the ERDF, because I never worked on the ERDF.
Sure.
But
were you involved in any way with the vitrification plant or that type of waste management?
not much. No, I can't say much about that. They did make a vault out there that they took tank farm waste and added concrete to, and that didn't work.
Are you talking about? No, you're not talking about BWIP, are you? Or is
No,
that
BWIP
separate?
is another deal. They had it's over by one of the A farm complexes,
Oh, okay.
but they were taking tank farm waste and trying to show that they could put it in a vault and solidify it. But I never followed it completely, but I don't think it ever lived up to its expectations.
You, as in cost expectations, or as in safety, or
As in meeting the environmental requirements.
Okay. I'm wondering if just quickly if we could go back in time a bit. Do you remember President Kennedy's visit?
Yeah, the Kennedy's visit.
Yep. Yeah. It's just I wonder if you could tell me about that.
Well, I had to work.
Oh,
But I was at Purex when that happened. And we had a door that the chemicals could come into the plant through, and it was looking north towards the end reactor. And I can remember the cars going crazy out there and coming back the same way. But so that's all I could visually see was what the traffic was going to and from. But no, I wasn't out there, and so I couldn't say much on that.
okay. When did your father retire from Hanford?
In the 60s.
Okay.
And they called him back, and he worked a few more times, 2,000 hours or whatever it was. And finally, my mom said, that's enough.
Where did your parents move after the bee house was sold?
Well, they bought another bee house about 3 or 4 blocks away from that one.
Oh, okay. And did they live there then for the rest of their lives?
Yes.
Okay.
They lived on one side for a while, and then they moved over to the other side and lived on the other side.
They rent out the other sides. Or,
Mm-hmm.
And so I just wonder, is there anything that we haven't mentioned in this interview that you'd like to talk about?
Well, depends. But it seems to me like, for instance, the burial requirements, and a lot of places were that way. But I searched and I searched, and I finally found the original burial requirement. And that was in an RWP, and it was about that long.
Sorry, what's an RWP?
Radioactive Work Procedure.
Okay.
And there was a paragraph in it that was for the burial grounds. And that was it. And as time progressed, that was in the 40s, and as time progressed, they became more and more complicated and so forth because we had new requirements to meet. And then in the probably the 80s, RCRA came in. And so hazardous chemicals was also part of the problem. And so you had to keep rad and hazardous and meet both requirements
In the burial grounds.
in the burial grounds. The funny thing is, the first one I wrote was in the 70s. And DOE said, we want you to put the sanitary landfill in it too. So it covers not only the rad burial grounds, but the sanitary landfill, which is the one in between East area and the Y barricade. And so I put that in there, and we had to meet the requirements for that place in that document. And I had it divided up into the rad section and into the sanitaries. And so I issued it, and then DOE come back and says, what do you got this in there for, the sanitary? And I said, because you told me to. And they said, we'll take it out. So they took it out. And, or I took it out because I had to rewrite it. And I was in on a lot of the rewrites after that. The documents got so thick and so forth, it was almost a full-time job just to get that done. So that was probably something that was very important. And the paper trail is not complete as far as I know. It took me a couple, 3 years to find the original one.
This report from the 40s.
Yeah.
And where was that? Or where does this appear in?
Well, I don't know where it is, but an engineer had it, and he had squirreled it away. And I found out through word of mouth and so forth where I might find it, and lo and behold, I finally did. But a lot of that early stuff.
Was it a Hanford generated report?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
It's got a number and everything on it, and but that was interesting. In talking to some of the people, because the last third or so of the report I put together on the burial grounds, I interviewed the people that were involved in the burial grounds, and got a lot of good information from that.
You mean people that were involved in the early
East and West burial grounds.
And so you were kind of doing your own oral histories.
Well, that was for my document that I put together. It's
Sure.
about that thick, or
Yeah.